It's 5:33, so I say we go ahead and get started with our wonderful board chair, Ms. Lynn McBee.
Well, thank you for joining this evening, and hopefully a few more people came on. We had a really great response to this first ever EarthX membership Meet the Earth Expert, and our Earth Expert tonight is Mr. Amos Eno, so you'll hear from him in a few minutes, but we are glad you're spending an hour of your night with us, and I want to thank the Development and Community Outreach team led by the very capable hands of Virginia Mudge for putting this together. And without further ado, I will pass it off to Dalton. I believe Dalton O'Neill is going to introduce himself and then introduce our guest. And again, thanks for being with us tonight. Bring your friends to future things, and we look forward to connecting more.
Thanks so much, Lynn, and thank all you guys for being here, guys and gals. We're super happy to have a member event and a super special treat. We have a, very special guest here today. A little bit about myself. I've worked for EarthX a few years as a volunteer, as a consultant, and now managing a couple different verticals, including regenerative agriculture, farm, ranch, hemp. And I've learned so much about forestry working with Amos, and I'm super excited to have a great conversation with him about it. I host events, help produce events. COVID kind of messed that up. EarthX has been a great fit for me. Personal development, learning all about these things, different verticals. It's not just one situation. It's not just one issue. All these things kind of fit together to make our planet a safer and healthier place. So that's enough about me. I would love to introduce Amos. Mr. Amos Eno is the president and founder of the Land Conservation Assistance Network, shorter for LandCAN, as well as the founder of a consulting company called Resources First Group. His career spans over 40 years as a conservationist and leading edge thinker in the environmental movement. He's challenged the government, the corporate world, and environmental leaders to think differently about environmental policy on conservation versus preservation, development, and land use. Amos's past career timeline includes, this is very impressive, executive director of the New England Forestry Foundation, the National Wildlife Foundation, the director of wildlife programs, and the National Audubon Society, as well as the editor of the Audubon Wildlife Report. He was special assistant in the Office of the Endangered Species. And we also encourage you to use the chat as these go on. So without further ado, Amos, do you have anything else to say about yourself and your background before we get started? You're on mute here, though.
There we go. All right. Good evening, everybody. My background, basically it's multi-generational. My great uncle was Gifford Pinchot. My dad was on the board of National Audubon, so I grew up as a bird watcher. My first job out of college was working for the Secretary of the Interior. And I started focusing on private lands when I was executive director of the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, because 70% of the United States is privately owned and very few people are talking to that market.
That's it's really crazy when you talk about your family history and you keeping it in the family. And I know all the EarthX folks are super big fans of Gifford Pinchot, so we're happy to have you here again. Will you explain how you came up with LandCAN? And I encourage everybody, if you're on your computer, look up the LandCAN. So at the end, when we ask questions, you can see how magnificent this resource is. But what inspired you to come up with LandCAN?
So during my National Fish and Wildlife years, I started focusing on private lands. The whole thrust of the environmental movement for 50 or more years has been on augmenting our public lands, our parks, refuges, and forests. But nobody's talking to the private landowners who own 70% of the United States. And during my years at National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, for example, I gave the grants to set up the private lands program at Texas Parks and Wildlife, which is unique. There are over 33 million acres enrolled. I gave grants to create cattlemen's land trusts to deal with the ranching community in California, Colorado, and Texas. And when I left National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, I had set up a private lands program. But when you think about it, the problem statement, you got 13 million landowners across the country and nobody's talking to them, but every family is unique, and you can't take a cookie cutter approach or a bureaucratic approach to helping them. So our approach was to create the entire spectrum of information, federal, state, nonprofit, and for-profit, put it on one platform, make it easy, free access. And so that's what we're doing. And we're now getting 1,000 users a day, almost 30,000 a month. And we've built 9 state sites. We're building our 10th state now for Georgia. And we have an endangered species site. We just uploaded the Monarch site, which covers 11 states in mid-America.
That's great. Once again, I'll encourage everybody to simultaneously look up this website. It's very intricate and full of great resources. On a hot take, Amos, what's the best resource on the land can for environmentalists? If it was just a straight shot HOV lane to the best resource for environmentalists, what would you say it is?
I mean, we basically got access to every type of information you would want. So it's kind of hard to anticipate that. For the landowning public, I think the most important resource are tax and estate attorneys, because farmers are over 60 years old, forest owners are over 70. They all should be in estate planning. We also have over 5,000 attorneys on the site. We have over 5,000 consulting foresters. But it's an entire potpourri of information, from clean energy to wildlife to gardening, you name it, veterinarians, anything that helps you with your day-to-day problems to make your life and conservation better.
That's great. Thanks, Amos. So before we jump into the Western fire crisis, which we're going to get to, what trends do you see right now taking place with just the forestry movement in general?
Forestry movement, I mean, there are roughly 13 million landowners in this country. 10.7 are forestry owners. So they're actually 4/5 of the market. And both agriculture and forestry are going in opposite directions on the landscape. Farms are getting bigger, particularly in the corn and soy belt of mid-America. And forest landowners' ownership is fragmenting, particularly in the Southeast, around our burgeoning metropolitan areas in the Southeast. And so the ownerships are getting smaller and smaller. And I think both of those trends are going to continue.
Right on. That makes sense. So we're digging straight into it, Amos. Western forest fires is our focus right now. What exactly are we dealing with?
Whew. Well, first, we're staring at a century of conscious policies creating an incendiary environment across the West. This stems from fire suppression in our Western forest. It dates back to Teddy Roosevelt and Gimper Pinchot days, 1909, the Great Fire of 1910, and what emanated from that, the Smokey Bear Syndrome. We're also dealing with the creeping effect of really unconscious policies, such as building homes for 5 decades in what's called the wildland-urban interface. And then you have on top of that the effects of compounding environmental regulations. So second, you're confronting 50 years of a legacy of environmental activism that designated millions of acres of wilderness areas, restricting all forest management. The Wilderness Act says the land should be untrammeled by the hands of man. You also have the addition of huge roadless areas, so limiting access. And then you have the huge regulatory imprint of the Endangered Species Act, such as the spotted owl listing in 1990, which sounded the death knell for most small Western forest products companies, and you lost over 70,000 jobs in the Pacific Northwestern states. Third, on top of the regulatory burdens, you have annual litigation challenges by the environmental community to prevent tree salvage, forest management based on the Endangered Species Act, NEPA, and California air regs. This trifecta of environmental litigation leads to immobilization of forest management and institutionalization of a philosophy that you can't cut a tree. This is not only occurring in the West, it's also imperiling the pine lands in New Jersey, where a catastrophic fire will smoke out both Philadelphia and New York City because of the buildup of fuels over the last 50 years in the pine lands, and a forest that abuts the largest swaths of suburbia in the country.
We appreciate that. We might just circle back in some layman's. I've had the chance to talk with you, but it's so fascinating hearing these high level terms coming out of you. You mentioned smoky bear syndrome. Can you elaborate more on what the smoky bear syndrome is?
Put out the fire. Don't have a fire. I mean, starting with the Great Fire of 1910, the Forest Service, and Smokey the Bear came from a cartoon of Teddy Roosevelt, who went black bear hunting in Mississippi and decided to save a cub. That became the advertising campaign for the Forest Service to put out fires, build fire watchtowers across the West, and basically implement very strict fire suppression policies that changed what the natural landscape and ecosystem historically had endured with periodic fires. And American Indians, for millenniums, burned to improve habitat for their hunting and fishing.
We appreciate all these answers, Amos. So what's the magnitude of this? I mean, we see it on the news in the summer in California and different places. We all care at the time, but it seems like people kind of forget about it. What's the magnitude of all this?
I mean, it is immense. It's huge. And that's part of the problem with the reporting on this issue, because they lose the context of both the historiography and the immensity of what's going on. It's going to take decades to work out of this problem. About half of our nation's 885 million acres of forest lands require immediate restorative forest management. In terms of Western forest fires, the 10-year average is 61,000 fires, burning 6.7 million acres annually. Last year, 2020, we had 57,000 fires that burned 10.4 million acres. We've had comparable fire years in 2018, 2015 to 17, 2011 to 12, 2004 to 2009, 2000 to 2001. So it's a 20-year phenomenon. We've already had 183,000 fires burn in 2021. And you also have to recognize the health problems. Smoke emanating from these fires is a major health threat and a killer, killing 15 to 44,000 deaths. And there are over 300 Western counties that see major smoke waves in recent years, and they're going to face this for decades.
What do you think the bottleneck has been? As you mentioned, 50 years, we've had different political parties in office. What's the bottleneck here?
Lack of leadership at the Forest Service and in the executive branch, lack of effective reaction by Congress, and I would say misdirection and misreaction by the environmental community that routinely says, oh, it's global warming. When, that's sort of what I call agenda annexation, where you take any natural disaster and pin it to your favorite cause as a propellant. But yeah, we have had a longer fire season, and the West has experienced intermittent drought for several decades. But the cause of these fires is a multi-decade growth of fuel loads. California today has 90 million acres of dead trees. To put out these fires, you're going to have to take forest management to a continental scale. And it hasn't happened at any level of government yet.
Well, let's get into the global warming piece a little bit, because that's a hot topic. I mean, you see half of California burning and they say it's global warming. Can you elaborate more? Does global warming play any effect to making it worse, or is it a non-starter for you?
No, it is making it worse. I mean, you're getting probably 2 months of extra fire season in spring and fall. And we've obviously had hotter temperatures for the last 30 years. But it's not the real reason. And people completely lose sight of the historiography. I mean, for example, California missions. The California missions basically were abandoned in the late 1600s and 1700s because they had a 30-year drought. And this isn't the first time we've had warming in Western states. So what's different is the fuel loads, because Western forests are all ecosystem adapted to periodic burning, which the American Indians did on a continental scale. And that's what has stopped since turn of the century, 1900.
And just in a few sentences, folks can look it up. Can you explain what prescribed burns are to the members?
Yeah, prescribed burns are basically when in the spring, you set a fire under very carefully controlled circumstances. It's really prevalent in the southeastern states. For example, the grass communities under longleaf pine, where quail plantations are and whatnot. It's really difficult to do in the West because, for example, in California, the clean air regulations only allow about 3 days a year when you could do a burn, which isn't enough time for when you have tens and thousands of acres of burned trees. But fire philosophy, fire management have come light years in the last 30 or 40 years, but it's still an underused management strategy.
As you mentioned, that was one of the primary tools Native Americans used for forest management was prescribed burns.
Definitely. And nationwide, in the East, in the Southeast, and in the West. And that forests used to have major openings. For example, if you read any of the literature of the Oregon Trail, when the wagon trains came out of the Snake River Canyon into the Blue Mountains of Oregon, the trees were 60 feet apart and they broke out and spread out mile across as they rode through the forest. You can't get a dog to crawl through those forests today. And that's what's happened to our Western forests. The fuel load is just astronomical.
It's wild. What are we going to do, Amos? How are we going to get out of this mess? With 50 years of political bottlenecks and mismanagement, how are we going to make the Forest Service cool enough to get some action in here?
Well, the solutions are actually pretty simple, both in terms of policy, but they're going to be very expensive. It's the bottom line. First, we need to take our cues from the Amerindian communities and their spokespeople. And that's why the EarthX show, which is going to run in the end of May, begins with Amerindian interviews. We have a plethora of anthropological data going back millennia, as well as recent cultural history showing and documenting the extensive burning for forest management of our Amerindian antecedents across America. And it's in today's management world, many of the tribes, like the Menominee tribe in northern Wisconsin, are about the best forest managers in the United States. Second, the issue will only be addressed by sustained federal funding on the order of $2 billion a year, additional funding for the U.S. Forest Service and companion federal agencies like the Bureau of Land Management. We're currently spending a mere $510 million on forest management. That needs to be quadrupled to $2 to $3 billion annually, and probably ramped up on a trajectory of 10 to 20 years and possibly longer for sustained forest management on public lands. And everybody knows this in Congress. I mean, this was first addressed in the Bush administration and then subsequently the Obama administration, but no effective funding was put in place. Congress sort of has tweaked the wheel of funding and borrowed money, and all the traditional programs of the Forest Service for wildlife and international affairs have suffered because and been contracted because all the funding is going to fire suppression. This Western forest fire issue should be incorporated as a major provision in any forthcoming infrastructure bill crafted by Congress in the next 2 years. The problem's been building for 100 years. The workout's going to take at least 30 years, and an investment of $2 to $3 billion is a trifling if you look at what the current congressional leadership is talking about for their funding bills. Third, there needs to be unprecedented level of cooperation and formalized coordination between the multiple federal agencies, the U.S. Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service as a core, as well as state fire agencies like CAL FIRE, local county governments, and private forest owners like the National Association of Forest Owners for a landscape scale management implementation strategy. And finally, the administration and Congress needs to put an end to environmental litigants seeking to impede forest management practices by passing no injunction legislation. Congress actually has done this before in the face of national emergencies with labor. For example, with the passage of the Norris-LaGuardia Act in 1932.
I mean, it certainly is a national emergency when half of California is on fire. I mean, everybody knows somebody that's been affected by these fires. When you're talking about these interagency cooperation with all these different agencies that kind of focus on it, I mean, are they cooperating at all to your knowledge, or
They
are
they're cooperating, but again, they're suffering from a de minimis level of funding, and all of it is basically reactionary. All the funding right now is going to fire suppression, putting out the fire, but they're not addressing the forest management, which is causing the fuel to the fire. And that's on millions and millions and millions of acres. I mean,
see.
it's not just California. It's Oregon, it's Washington, it's Idaho, it's Montana, it's Wyoming, parts of Utah, Colorado. It's Arizona. It's a West-wide phenomenon.
You talk about the Western Governors Association tackling it once a year, trying to talk about it. It's a little off script, Amos, but we talked about it once offline about certain homeowners not being able to get insurance because they're in a fire area, right? Is there more you can elaborate on that? I mean, you're not allowed to build in a floodplain, but people are just building. Is there anything you have to say about that?
Well, that's what I mentioned in the beginning of the talk. That's the unconscious aspect of allowing people to build homes in the wildland urban interface. And that's where county governments and state governments have to take issue with this. And they're going to have to come up with a regulatory approach. That's what's made prescribed burning, that and the clean air rules in California, so difficult to address these issues.
I see. You have the regulations of you can only burn so much, but if you're in the middle of a forest, you at least need to prescribe burn your own area.
Yeah, and that takes weeks, not 2 or 3 days that would permit, and the clean air permit in California would allow.
So I know we're really excited about our EarthX fire show coming up. As you mentioned, will air later this year, and we'll talk about Peterson's book, First Put Out the Fire, at the end with the members. But what do you think EarthX can do here? What's our role in this? How can we get the word out?
I think there's a huge opportunity for EarthX to play a positive role here. For 50 years, the environmental movement in the United States has been propelled on sort of an east-west axis of bicoastal elites. On the West Coast, you have the Sierra Club, Friends of the Earth out of San Francisco, and that's metastasized to embrace California, Oregon, Washington, now Arizona with the Center for Biological Diversity. On the East Coast, you have the New York, DC axis of National Audubon, NRDC, EDF, Wilderness Society, dominating the environmental agenda. But in my opinion, it's been treading water for intellectually and politically for decades. The movement's prescriptions emanating from this bicoastal axis, they're unrealistic, and they undermine our economy, American leadership, and our social strength. EarthX, is headquartered in Dallas, Texas. You have 7 major metropolitan areas in Texas that are full of green activists and environmentalists, but they're living cheek by jowl with our fossil fuel industry and some of the most innovative companies in America, which are moving to Texas in droves from these bicoastal states. And I think there's an opportunity for EarthX to create common sense, entrepreneurial, technological innovation, and bipartisan political harnessing to solve some of these myriad environmental issues. The Western Forestry Show, we have 25 speakers, moderated by Mark Ray, one of my board members who was Undersecretary of Department of Agriculture in the Bush administration and started the administration's attempt to address these forest management issues. And I think EarthX has a very compelling role to put some of these issues, their historiography, the Amerindian approach, which the general public doesn't know anything about, and put them front and center of the public with solutions, real solutions. And I think this is very possible. And I applaud EarthX for taking this on.
I think that's great, Amos. One of the things I love about EarthX, just to the, in its core, is we believe business can create environmental change. So you're talking about all these problems that the government's failed to address. That's room for the private sector to create innovative solutions. So I encourage everybody, again, look up the land can. If you could start putting some questions in the chat if you have any. I think it's a good time. You're holding a book, Amos. Would you like to tell us about this magnificent book you're holding?
Yeah, this is James Peterson's book, First Put Out the Fire. And I have 50 copies. So if any of your viewers would like them, if you take the names, we'll send them to them. And to go back to your previous question, as I mentioned with Spotted Owl basically crushed the small forest products industry in Western states. There's a whole effort to try and restore community-based forestry in the West that involves private sector innovation and solutions. And that's going to be a major part of any solution to forest management in the West. And Jim Peterson's book covers a lot of these new innovative efforts at a community-based level.
That's great. Yeah, the book's really great with amazing infographics and pictures. I mean, it's really fun to read. And it's visually, pleasing to understand these very complex issues. So we're getting to the Q&A portion of this. Again, I'd love for you guys to plug in the chat. And we have our first question that was already preloaded from Elizabeth Halliday. Her question is, what is the best resource for finding trees and plants that absorb the greatest amount of carbon?
I saw this, fortunately, and before I left the office, and I gave her question to my son, Amos Pinchot. And it's amazing the resources you have online. First of all, LandCan hosts a lot of native species nurseries. And our new Monarch site, for example, has a ton of nurseries and even have a plant list. But she's in Long Island, and there's a good overview in gettreeprint.com, best trees to absorb carbon. And another source, making your garden a carbon sink, jledaystore.org, 5 steps to making your garden a carbon sink. I looked up both of the sites, and the short answer to her question is in Long Island, probably planting silver maple and tulip trees are the best carbon sequestration species. But there's voluminous information online. And if you're of my age and don't go to the internet every second, get your younger generation to help you.
That's great. Yeah, she lived in New York and was wondering what's the best tree she could plant to do the best she could.
Silver maple and tulip tree have the greatest sequestrations. Tulip poplar. It's also called yellow poplar.
Are to your knowledge, are tree genetics folks working on this at the tree farms to create, genetically modified trees that absorb more carbon, or is that?
Again, you have lots of efforts on this. There's on LandCan, we host an organization called Green Trees, which is planting mostly cottonwoods as an understory all through the Mississippi Valley to restore the forests from Louisiana north to Ohio. And they're getting, and big companies, Norfolk Southern, a lot of the banks and whatnot are getting carbon credits out of this. You also have the same thing going on with grasslands and new carbon sequestration management policies to restore grasslands that ranchers are doing. And they're all online on LandCan as well.
That's great. So we have about 10 to 15 more minutes available for Q&A. I have a few more questions I'll ask, but I'd like to open it up to any of the members. I don't want to be greedy asking all the questions. So if anybody has a question, I'd love you guys to ask Mr. Eno himself.
Amos.
Eno. Hey, it's fair. You have a Wikipedia page, man. We call you Mr. Eno.
Okay, well, this may be a little out there, but I just kind of want to see if we have any thoughts on it. So I'd say read, but I skimmed an article today in the New York Times Magazine that was talking about trees being social creatures, like their roots being connected with kind of this fungus that kind of helps them communicate. Can you tell me a little more about that and what makes a tree a social creature?
I'm not sure I can talk about the social aspects, but tree roots are alive with microfungi that obviously in a forest become interconnected and stuff. And it's one of the most important parts of tree growth and survivability. And I mean, there's a whole new science to this that has arisen in the last 30, 40 years. I can't elaborate more than that.
That's great. Thank you.
Can you tell us for fun just a little bit more about your family history and maybe, Gifford Pinchot insider stuff?
Oh, sure. Well, Gifford Pinchot's mother was Mary Eno, who was my great-grandfather's younger sister. And, I grew up with the Pinchots lived in Milford, Pennsylvania on the upper Delaware. And Gifford's father built Gray Towers, which became Gifford's home. And actually, as I mentioned, my dad was a bird watcher, and we used to go to Gray Towers. And my dad, on the drives, would tell me in the 1930s, he would go to Gray Towers, but he found dinners with Uncle Gifford a little bit trying because, among other things, Gifford was a teetotaler. So he would go to his Uncle Amos's house. Gifford's younger brother was Amos Eno Pinchot. So my father would always go and fortify himself with several bourbons before going to Gifford's house for dinner. Obviously, my father's interest, and his father was one of the founders of Acadia National Park in Maine and was the first ornithologist for Acadia. So my father got interested in conservation, served on the board of Audubon when I was in college, and I started going to board meetings with him. And that's really what got me started. My first job out of Princeton was working for the Secretary of the Interior in 1973, back in the Nixon administration.
That's really amazing stuff. I'll give somebody else a chance here. I've got more of these historical questions. Maybe a little Teddy Roosevelt action. Anybody else have a question here? You guys are missing a chance here. It's fun. Oh, here you go, Julie.
Okay, so I had a question regarding birds. The migratory flights through North America,
right,
are supposed to be kind of not endangered, but being threatened. What are anything that we can do to assist birds in their migration?
Lots. So what you're talking about in the scientific term, or the agency term, is neotropical migratory birds. And that's everything from, that's all our songbirds: warblers, grosbeaks, orioles, hummingbirds, grassland sparrows, the long distance migrants, and includes hawks, like the broadwing hawk that comes up to northern states in New England and then funnels down through Mexico to Latin America every year. Dick thistles that go to Venezuela. When I was running National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, we started a program called Partners in Flight to address this issue in 1990. And it had two elements. One was domestic US conservation. The other was Latin America. The majority of their migrants only go to about 5 countries: Mexico, the islands of Cuba, Hispaniola, Jamaica, and about as far south as Costa Rica. And there are a few exceptions that go further, but most of them go those areas. And I did grants for almost 10 years and had an office in Guatemala with a brilliant woman who ran that office. And we did programs in the United States in cooperation with the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service, BLM, and Department of Defense is actually one of the largest conservation agencies for migratory birds. I left NIFWF in 2000, and my successors terminated the program. Ironically, in the last 2 years, the Fish and Wildlife Services reached out to me to restart the program, because the articles you're referring to is a lot of our songbirds are declining even more drastically now than they were 30 years ago when I started Partners in Flight, particularly the grassland species. And the habitat for those species is the same habitat that is important for pollinators and monarch butterflies, which we just built a new site on Habitat Can for monarchs that involves 11 states. So I'm actually in discussions with Fish and Wildlife Service right now on how to restart Partners in Flight. But the key to the equation is going to be private landowners, because all those states from Texas to Minnesota are 90% privately owned. And a totally different approach, and out of the box approach, is going to have to be taken to address this issue effectively.
I remember hearing, Julie, I've seen it come up in Dallas a few times where they're trying to turn off the lights on all the skyscrapers. Amos, do you concur that we should probably do that, or?
Skyscrapers are a problem. Windmills are a problem. The wind energy mills are killing millions of birds. There are a lot of aspects of this. Even a lot of the new solar farms in California and stuff are roasting birds. They're so strong.
Yikes.
So there are a lot of aspects of this.
Could you tell us a good Gifford Pinchot and Teddy Roosevelt story? I know we're big Teddy Roosevelt folks over here at EarthX. There's a big statue when you walk into or just a head.
Well,
a head.
I mean, Teddy Roosevelt did more for conservation than any president in the United States history. He started creating national wildlife refuges. He created almost over 100 million acres of national forest lands. He vastly augmented National Park Service. He created also the administrative superstructure. I mean, Gifford Pinchot was the first chief of the Forest Service and created a highly professional, almost militaristic bureaucracy that was totally dedicated to forest management. And the two of them got along like two peas in a pod. Pinchot wrote a good many of Roosevelt's speeches. And Roosevelt was one of the most effective speakers of any American president. And, you know, and he loved hunting and fishing, even though, I mean, he grew up as a child as really frail. But when he went out after his wife and his mother died and he went ranching in the Dakotas, he gained strength, got really interested in the outdoors, and he knew firsthand what it took to implement conservation. And I mean, the guy was brilliant. There's still the history of the naval war of 1812 was written by Teddy Roosevelt as a 23-year-old. The guy was amazing.
That's amazing. I got two more questions. If somebody else has one, raise your hand or whatnot. This is pretty exciting. I was speaking to some Brazilian firefighters. We'll get to you, Kate. Brazilian firefighters come to America and learn. Are there any other? I mean, we used to teach all the forest management practices here. Is it still like that? Folks send people to us and we teach them, send them home. We just can't take care of our own fires.
You have the Boise Fire Center, which is BLM and Forest Service. A number of the universities, Arizona, Clemson, Georgia, their forestry schools have fire ecology centers and stuff. I mean, in terms of academic leadership and in terms of agency training, the United States is top of the heap. But that's more focused on fire suppression, not on forest management.
I see.
That's what's been under the covers all along, and nobody's paid attention to it.
Yeah, those Brazilian folks said if they hadn't come here, they wouldn't have learned, and now they teach all their people in Brazil. It's great. I think we had a question from Ms. Kate.
Yes, I'm sure many of us consider ourselves to be environmentalists and want to support groups that are doing the right thing, but it sounds as though some of them may be doing the opposite.
You got it.
What you're saying.
You got it.
So which ones should we be supporting?
Probably, and particularly given this administration, the National Wildlife Federation, their CEO is a really good guy, and American Forest Foundation, LandCan, my own organization. A lot of the environmental community is really complicit with the problem that we're facing. And particularly the ones.
NRDC is more misguided?
Totally.
Really?
They're one of the litigants that are preventing forest management. So is the Center for Biological Diversity. I mean, my first boss was Nat Reed, who was on the board of NRDC, and I have real problems with a lot of what they're doing.
Amos Eno's the real deal. He'll tell you like it is. You know, you got to message him offline. Hit up the land can. We had a question from Mr. Mike, and then we got one more follow-up.
Yeah, thank you. It seems like a lot of what you're suggesting that really needs to be done to help the forests, you know, in terms of real money and certainly management and fires. The real enemy is governments trying to protect lands for humans and protect our growth. And yet we add a Chicago to our population every year. And I haven't heard you mention our population growth. Am I missing something here?
Well, I mean, population growth is an issue, but it's, I mean, in terms of forest fires, it's suburbia moving into the fringe areas. That's what makes fires so dangerous. People get killed, so expensive. Buildings, towns are going up in smoke. And it's the expansion of suburbia into what were formerly wildlands and managed forests that is the point of the biggest controversy with these fires.
And yet isn't the biggest cause of that sprawl we're seeing, you know, this added population every year and our culture of eternal growth and believing growth will solve our problems?
Well, I mean, the immediate problem is we got to get the dead trees out of the forest, because that's we're staring at 20 years of 30 years of kindling that's going to keep going up in smoke.
Well, we'll get rid of all the dead trees by just building houses there.
Well, that's not going to happen because, again, you can't build houses on national forest land. We're talking about our public lands that are not being managed, and you can't build houses there.
Oh, I thought you were talking largely about those private lands, that 70%.
Different equation. I mean, the private lands are not, I mean, the Western states, most Western states are 30 to 70% publicly owned. The private lands are concentrated east of the 100th meridian from basically Kansas and Dakotas east. All those Midwestern states are 90% private. I live in Maine. Maine is 95% privately owned, and we have the healthiest forests in the nation.
Why is that?
Because they're not public forests, because we have active forest management and we don't have dead trees.
Would your slow growth rate in Maine be helpful on that?
Yeah. I mean, our total population in Maine is 1.3 million, so it's relatively small.
Yes.
But again, Maine was forested before. What we're dealing with is second, third generation growth. If you look at any picture of a Maine town or seacoast village, like I live in Freeport, 100 years ago, you'd see a dozen houses and one elm tree. And today, I mean, you're just dealing with a forested landscape. Connecticut today, which is our fourth or fifth most popular state, is 65% forested. People, I mean, lose sight of that. I mean, New England 100 years ago was basically void of forests. Today, it's all back.
But in terms of sustainability, where are we? In terms of our population expanding and emitting all the trash and the plastic, you know, and eating all the fish?
Well, you got a slew of environmental problems, and EarthX is coming up with shows that are going to feature a lot of these things. But some of what you're mentioning right now is kind of peripheral to the core issue of the forest fires in the West.
Yeah, I'm a big picture guy.
Yeah, it's, you know, something we've all, I think, learned as we gotten into this space is it's a massive amount of overlapping issues.
Oh, yeah.
And all kind of compound and affect one another. And yeah.
We are at the networking portion of this. We appreciate everybody sticking with us thus far. I did have one last question to pop in for Amos. If you're an entrepreneur that is hungry to jump into the forest management private sector, what type of businesses make sense to start or to start working on?
Well, I could give you my own example. I'm helping starting a new company in Maine called American Mass Timber to build modular housing from cross-laminated timber. And I mentioned earlier, I think one of the solutions in the West is to rebuild, restore community forest operations that can actually take some of this dead timber off, put it to good use. You have a lot of new innovative wood products like cross-laminated timber that can use a salvage timber. And I think the private sector is going to be a huge element of the solution to these issues.
Thanks for that. That's exciting. I mean, we have a EIR program at EarthX. There's a lot of other environmental businesses that are on the rise. So
yeah, AMT is actually submitted to Vikram.
okay, it's called AMT, American. One more time for the members,
Mass
myself.
American Mass Timber.
That's awesome. Shout out to American Mass Timber. We are officially at the networking portion. So we'd love to create a dialogue with everybody. It's unique to have a professional such as that. I mean, before this came on, Amos mentioned a lot of people, when people go home after work, they're not talking about forest management at the dinner table. So we've got a really interesting perspective here to ask Amos questions. And, I would just welcome an open dialogue.
Or I think if everyone's asked the questions they want to ask, we can thank you all so much for coming and being here. And we're so grateful for you, our members.
But Bethany mentioned Mike might be interested in the population show. I think that is a pretty good show. I've seen most of them. Look at EarthX TV, check out some of the programs we have, and, stay tuned. I'll let Virginia wrap it up from here.
Yeah. And if you want to go to our website, earthx.org, and check out all the cool stuff we're doing for Earth Week. We've got some new shows premiering. We've got a 10-day film festival. All of Julie Seymour's great work on the eco art competition. We'll have the 2021 winners announced there. And there's just all kinds of really cool stuff going on for Earth Week. And we really can't wait to be in person with you all again. And hopefully come fall, we'll be able to get together face to face and see each other, maybe shake a hand, which I know I'm really looking forward to. So, so thank you all for coming. And this was, like I said in the beginning, our inaugural members event. So we really appreciate you taking the time to join in and interact with us. And we're thankful for each and every one of you. So I hope everybody has a terrific evening, and we will see you at the next one.
Thank you,
guys.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
EarthXTV.com.
.org.
No, EarthXTV.com, starting on the 16th, our new on-demand platform. So everybody, please tune in.
Thank you, Steve. Awesome.
Y'all take it easy.
All right. Bye, everybody.